The first sign. It started with a whisper. At first, no one in Willow Creek paid much attention. A whisper could be the wind, a stray cat, or even the rustling of dry leaves. But then the knocks came. Every night, exactly at midnight, soft knocks echoed through the quiet streets. Some heard them on their doors, others on their windows. But whenever they checked, no one was there. The footsteps followed soon after. Slow, dragging steps that moved through the neighborhood like someone searching for something, or someone. Mrs. Eleanor's nightmare. Mrs. Eleanor was the first to see it. She was an old widow who lived alone in a small house near the town square. Every night she sat by her window with a cup of tea, watching the stars. But one night, as she looked out, she saw something standing near the street lamp. At first, she thought it was a person. The figure was tall and thin, almost too thin. It stood completely still, its head tilted slightly as if watching her. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move. A chill ran through her body. Something about it wasn't right. Its arms were too long, its legs too stiff. The darkness around it seemed wrong, as if the night itself was bending around its shape. She reached for the phone to call the police, but the moment she looked back, the figure was gone. That night, she locked every door and window, but the fear stayed with her, the children's fear. The next day, strange stories spread. Several children in the neighborhood woke up screaming. Their parents rushed to their rooms, expecting nightmares, but the children all said the same thing. Something was in my room. One boy, Timmy, refused to sleep alone after that night. He told his mother that a shadow stood by his bed, whispering his name. When she asked what the shadow looked like, he simply said, "It had no face." Another girl, Lucy, told her father she saw fingers crawling under her door, long, thin fingers tapping against the wood. But when he checked, there was nothing there. Parents began whispering among themselves. Was someone playing a cruel joke? A thief trying to scare them? Or was it something worse? A thief or something else? By the end of the week, almost every house had a story. Mr. Dawson, the grocer, swore he heard someone breathing outside his bedroom window. But when he looked, all he saw was a single wet footprint on the ground. Mrs. Harper, the school teacher, found her front door wide open in the morning, though she was certain she had locked it the night before. The police were called. They patrolled the streets, but they found nothing. There were no signs of break-ins, no footprints, no evidence of an intruder. "It's just paranoia," Officer Grant told the worried residents. "The mind plays tricks at night." But not everyone believed him. The disappearance of Mr. Thomas. Then one night, Mr. Thomas disappeared. He was a quiet man, always keeping to himself. He lived in a small house at the edge of town, near the old abandoned well. That night he'd been reading in his living room when he heard the footsteps, slow, dragging, coming from the street. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The night was cold, the wind still. "Who's there?" he called. The footsteps stopped. His breath came out in a misty cloud. He shone his flashlight down the street. Nothing. Then he heard it again, this time behind him. He spun around, but there was no one there. A chill ran through him. He could feel something watching him, something just beyond the light's reach. And then a whisper. "Thomas?" His heart pounded. The light flickered. The last thing he saw was a shadow stretching toward him, long fingers reaching out from the darkness. The next morning, his front door was wide open. His flashlight lay on the ground, the batteries drained. His shoes were found near the old well, but there was no sign of him. Mr. Thomas was gone, and at exactly midnight the whispers returned. The spirit awakens. The search for Mr. Thomas. The morning after Mr. Thomas disappeared, the town was in chaos. Neighbors gathered outside his house, whispering in fear. His front door was still open, his flashlight lay in the dirt, and his slippers sat neatly by his doorstep. But there was no sign of him. The police arrived, searching every inch of his home. Nothing was out of place, no signs of a struggle. It was as if he had simply walked out and vanished into the night. Then they found his shoes. They were near the old, abandoned well at the edge of town. The well had been covered with wooden planks for years, its edges worn and cracked. No one went near it. The air around it always felt colder, and the wind never seemed to touch it. Officer Grant bent down, picking up the shoes carefully. They were damp, as if soaked in morning dew, but the ground around them was dry. "This isn't right," he muttered. A few officers peered down into the well. It was deep, the bottom lost in darkness. They dropped a stone inside, waiting for the sound of it hitting the ground. Nothing, just silence. Midnight terror. That night, the town held a meeting. People spoke in hushed voices, afraid to say what they were all thinking. Mr. Thomas was gone, and it had something to do with the well. As the town argued about what to do next, Mrs. Eleanor stood up. Her hands trembled as she gripped her shawl tightly. "It has returned," she said softly. The room fell silent. "What are you talking about?" asked Mr. Dawson, the grocer. Mrs. Eleanor's eyes were dark with fear. "Long ago, before most of you were born, something haunted this town, and it all started with that well." A heavy silence settled over the crowd. Before anyone could ask more, the town clock struck midnight. Gong! The sound rang through the streets, deep and heavy. Then from the distance, a sound drifted through the air. A woman's laughter. It was soft at first, almost like the wind, but then it grew louder, echoing down the empty streets, creeping into every home, slipping through locked doors and shut windows. A cold, high-pitched giggle. It was the kind of laughter that didn't belong to anything human. The priest's warning. The next day, panic spread. People refused to go out at night. Some packed their bags, ready to leave town. Others nailed their windows shut, hoping to keep whatever was out there from coming inside. The mayor called Father Richard, the town priest, to bless the streets. Father Richard arrived that afternoon, dressed in his long black robe, carrying a small silver cross and a bottle of holy water. His face was calm, but his eyes held a shadow of concern. "Something evil has awakened," he said to the townspeople, "but fear will only feed it." Mrs. Eleanor stepped forward. "Do you know what it is?" Father Richard hesitated. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "A spirit, a restless one." The crowd murmured in fear. "Can you stop it?" Mr. Dawson asked. "I can try," the priest answered. That night, just before midnight, Father Richard walked through the streets, sprinkling holy water and whispering prayers. A few brave townspeople followed him, watching nervously. The air was heavy, thick with something unseen. The wind didn't blow, the crickets didn't chirp, everything was still. Then as the clock struck 12, the streetlights flickered. One by one they blinked out, swallowing the streets in darkness. The shadow in the square, a hush fell over the town. Then came the laughter. It was right behind them, cold, breathy, and full of something cruel. The people turned in horror. At the center of the town square stood a shadowy figure. It was tall and thin, its face hidden in darkness. Its long arms hung at its sides, fingers twitching slightly. It took a step forward. The ground beneath it seemed to ripple, as if the earth itself wanted to pull away. Father Richard held up his cross. "In the name of God, I command you to leave this place." The figure stopped. The laughter died. For a long moment there was silence. Then, without warning, the figure rushed forward. A gust of icy wind slammed into Father Richard, throwing him to the ground. The townspeople screamed, stumbling back. The streetlights flickered wildly, casting strange, twisting shadows on the walls. Father Richard gasped, struggling to breathe. An invisible force pressed against his chest, like cold hands pushing him down. His cross slipped from his fingers. The shadowy figure loomed over him, and then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. The wind stopped. The streetlights flickered back on. The air was still once more. Father Richard lay on the ground, gasping for breath. The townspeople stared in horror. No one spoke, but deep in the silence, they all knew one thing. The spirit was awake, and it wasn't going to stop.